From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
There is a legal standoff between Democratic Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson and the federal government over the sharing of voter data.
A lot of people will make the argument, oh, well, the federal government already has your social security number. Yes, it does, but not in this way, not tied to your voting record specifically.
On today's show, why the Justice Department is suing the state of Michigan for refusing to share information from the state's voter rolls.
But first, Detroit City Council President Mary Sheffield has been elected Detroit's next mayor.
And when some said that it couldn't be done, when some said that it was not the time, Detroit, you said, together we can.
Sheffield was endorsed by outgoing Mayor Mike Duggan, whose 12 years in office marked a new and productive relationship with Lansing. Duggan's brand is negotiating, and whether it was the city's post-bankruptcy comeback or an auto insurance overhaul, we saw new coordination and cooperation between the state capital and the state's largest city.
Nick Corey knows a lot about this relationship. He's worked for two governors. He's worked as the state treasurer of Michigan, and he worked for Mike Duggan as the city's chief of economic development. We're turning to him for his perspective on the relationship between Detroit and Lansing and lawmakers, administration officials, and lobbyists that he has seen up close firsthand for decades. Nick, hi.
Hi, pleasure to be here with you.
What is the first thing Mary Sheffield should do vis-a-vis her relationship with Lansing, and what do you think she'll be asking for?
Well, I'd say a few things. One, I'd start with she doesn't need my advice. I assume there's plenty of whispering in her ear this morning. But I have been involved in a couple of transitions, and I know that the next 6 or 7 weeks is really going to be critical for her to set up success in the first couple of years of her administration. And she's got to work on three things. The first is getting the right people in the right spot. She has been part of council where you have one or two staff members. Now she's going to be heading up an organization that has thousands of employees and over $1 billion budget. So she's got to get the right people into the departments to help her execute her agenda. The second thing she's got to do is she's got to prioritize her near-term policy goals. We always used to say you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, meaning on the campaign trail, you can say things like, I want to cut taxes, I want to create new programs. But now she has to really put meat on those bones and get into the details, set priorities, and understand the trade-offs. The third thing she has to do is what we're talking about, is she has to build bridges, especially for the people who didn't vote for her. And that is building bridges with people in Detroit, people in the suburbs, and then people in Lansing. Because in Michigan, as in most states, Lansing sets the agenda for many of the terms of running a city, both statutorily, regulatory, and then what's in the state budget. So she really should spend time reaching out, not just to the Detroit delegation, although that's important in Lansing, but everyone else in Lansing, people from the west side of the state, people from upper Michigan, and then the people who are running Lansing these days. She really needs to spend this next 6 or 7 weeks trying to build a relationship without any asking specific policy proposals, but just building a relationship, finding those areas of common ground so that when there are disagreements on policy, and there will be quite a few, she at least establishes that personal relationship. So that's what I think she's got to do the next 7 weeks. It is a lot on the agenda. You have to, take today off, sleep in, enjoy today, and then hit the ground running tomorrow on a transition.
Sheffield, of course, was endorsed by Mike Duggan. How much of that endorsement and her relationship with the mayor should be part of her introduction into Lansing? Does she start fresh and from the beginning? Or is it sort of like, no, I want to continue this relationship that Detroit under Duggan has created that's really changed the dynamics between the state and the city over the past 12 years?
It has. At least I would argue it has. It's gotten much better than a couple of decades ago when it first started out. That's a question she'll have to decide on, because on the one hand, she wants to build on the progress the mayor has made. On the other hand, she has to assert her independence as a new mayor. So, you can't just be viewed, shouldn't just be viewed as Mike Duggan number two. And so creating that independence will be important. It becomes much more complicated because, as we know, he's running for the governor too. So it's possible in 12 months he'll be the governor. So the relationship with Lansing will obviously change when you have someone from Detroit who's been a partner for the last 12 years suddenly running the state. So I would say build on the successes of Mike over the last 12 years, but you build a perception that you're your own administration, your own mayor, and you're not going to follow the exact path that Mike paved over the last 12 years.
I mean, Mike Duggan is obviously running as an independent, but the mayor of Detroit is typically a leader of the Democratic Party in Michigan, even if the office itself is technically nonpartisan. How much does which political party in Lansing, how much does that matter in terms of who's in charge or divided government, which is what we have right now? How much does that make a difference?
Well, quite a bit of difference in the approach you take, I think, in that you need to cast a wider net. I was talking about those relationships. You need to cast a much wider net when it's divided government. Now, having said that, it's not a Democrat-Republican divide per se. For example, when I was there a few years ago, we had a large package to really restructure Detroit public schools, eliminate all their debt, put them on a path for success. And when I was working that in Lansing, I actually found more support in West Michigan than I did in Southeast Michigan. It was a coalition of West Michigan Republicans that really helped pass it. So it's not Republican-Democrat, but with divided government in Lansing, it does make things more complicated because you just have more bases to touch. You have more people who are controlling the levers of policy. So you do have to work a little harder, but it does force you to reach across the aisle, which is usually a good thing.
I guess to follow up on that, why should people and the lawmakers who represent them, who don't live in the city, and as you pointed out, sometimes there's more tension between the outer areas of Metro Detroit than there are further away, but for people who don't live in the city, why should they spend time thinking and caring about Detroit and the new Mary Sheffield administration?
Well, I would say in my own view, that's one of the things that's really improved over the last decade or two, that there is a recognition across the state that what happens in Detroit impacts all of the state. The financial health, the economic health of the city of Detroit really is a catalyst for so much of the rest of the state. It's not as Detroit goes, there goes the state. That's not right. But it is an important platform. If you're trying to build your city in Grand Rapids or Traverse City or Muskegon, the impression Detroit has and the spillover from Detroit, the national reputation for Detroit, is important as you build your local community. And I think people more and more realize that this isn't a zero-sum game. As Detroit progresses, the suburbs progress, the outstate progresses too. And I think people are realizing that more and more. And I think it's the same in the city, that as what happens in Lansing, what happens outside the city is also critical to continue the development within the city.
Nick Curry, former treasurer of the state of Michigan, former Detroit Economic Development Chief. Thanks so much for your insight.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
The state of Michigan is in the middle of a legal standoff over voter data privacy. Michigan Democratic Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson is refusing to share voter information with the federal government.
The Justice Department, part of President Donald Trump's administration, is suing Benson for voter records that include driver's license numbers and the last 4 digits of Social Security numbers.
The Justice Department wants the information because it says the state is not doing a good enough job cleaning its roll of ineligible voters. Haley Harding with VoteBeat has been following the story and is here now. Haley, hi.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's just start with why the federal government says it wants this information. Can you explain?
Yeah, so the federal government has not gone quite so far as to say, this is explicitly what we're using this information for, which is important because there is a federal requirement that when the federal government is collecting this information, they do outright state that. That is a point over and over again in these lawsuits. But the argument more broadly from the president and from his administration is that the states are not doing enough to clean up their voter rolls, to get rid of dead voters, to find voters who have moved. The states obviously argue they are doing a good enough job, and oftentimes the argument also comes down to it is entirely up to the states to maintain their own voter rolls. There is not any sort of federal regulation there.
What does it mean to maintain a voting roll? Why is it a big deal?
So the thing about voter rolls is they are, at their core, just the big list of every person in the state of Michigan or whichever state, the big list of who is a registered voter. It is very, very normal for voter rolls to have people on them who have died, who have moved out of state, out of a community, out of wherever. Like a lot of the problem with voter rolls is that they are just a big list of people. And in Michigan, where we have, some 8 million registered voters, that's a massive undertaking to maintain a list like that. A lot of times, a better way to look at these voter rolls is that they're data. They're not necessarily people. And when you look at it that way, you can come to understand that sometimes someone's going to be on there twice because their registration got moved and they're not voting at both addresses. Or maybe like your grandma died and the county has not gotten around yet to updating the state on that. That's a thing that happens all the time because these rolls are maintained by people.
So what specifically then is the federal government asking for, and how does it pertain to this issue of the state's voter rolls?
So the federal government is asking, and they say they're going to ask all of the states for this, but they haven't quite gotten around to that yet. What they're asking Michigan for specifically is the entire voter roll, which in Michigan is your name, address, the elections you voted in. The federal government is also asking for the personal identifying information, which in Michigan is your driver's license number and the last 4 digits of your social security number. The state of Michigan has made the argument you can have the public version of the voter roll, which is this massive 3 gigabyte file with, some 8 million people's names in it, but you may not have the personal identifying information because there are both federal and state laws that prevent Michigan from sharing that with anybody, much less the federal government.
And what was the state's, that is, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson's argument for not sharing the information?
Her big argument is that it is a violation of federal and state law to share these things. There is something called the Privacy Act of 1974, which is a very boring name for a law, but it requires outright that the federal government, when it is collecting information on anybody, it has to explicitly say what it is planning on using that information for and how it is storing it. The federal government, in regards to these voter rolls, has not done that. And a lot of people will make the argument, oh, well, the federal government already has your social security number. Yes, it does, but not in this way, not tied to your voting record specifically, and not all connected together in what appears to be a larger effort to prove citizenship across the board.
How much of this is just trust that Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson simply doesn't trust the Trump administration not to abuse this information?
Sure, that could be part of it. We could say this is politics, but we could also point to, I believe it was 2017, when the first Trump administration made a very similar request under very similar circumstances. And then Secretary of State Ruth Johnson also declined to share the information under almost the exact same arguments. This is not new, this idea that the federal government might like to collect this information. And it is not new that the state is going to say no, because there are federal laws and state laws that forbid them from doing so.
Haley, you said that other states have been asked in this cycle, not all of them, though. How have other states responded? Are they similar to how Benson's responded, saying, no, you can't have all of the information, you can only have redacted information?
Yeah, a number of states, Pennsylvania comes to mind, have basically said, you too can have the public voter roll. And I want to be clear, anybody can get access to the voter roll. You can request it from the Secretary of State's office, and you too will get this giant 3 gigabyte file, right? Pennsylvania has offered their version of the public one. Some states have handed it over wholesale, it appears. I think Florida might be one of those states. But a number of states have outright said, no, we will not be giving this to you. Federal law and state law prohibits us from doing that. I do believe it was the Maine Secretary of State who told the Trump administration to go jump into the Gulf of Maine. So, it does a lot of times come down to who is the party in control of the voter rolls, kind of directing their response. But a lot of states are saying, we would give this to you. We have nothing to hide, but we legally cannot. We are in violation of state and federal privacy laws if we give that to you. And when someone has the last 4 digits of your social security number, when someone has your driver's license number, there's a lot of things they can do with that if it is mishandled, if it is hacked, if it is a million other things. And the state does not want that on their head.
Haley, certainly lots of attention has been paid to this election, but it's not anywhere near what it is like in a presidential election. So maybe right now this feels like the stakes are a little less urgent or the temperature is not as hot. But I'm curious about what the consequences of this fight are, whether it be legal, political, or even just for voters themselves.
I think in this particular moment, Michigan is at a really interesting point because our chief election official, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, is also running for governor. She is polling shows she is the Democratic gubernatorial frontrunner, right? So we are at a very interesting point where this woman is both running our elections as a state, but also running her own campaign. I think it'd be foolish to pretend that those two things aren't happening simultaneously. But I think the bigger argument here is whether or not these states have the right to give over this full wholesale information. And time again, pretty much every state's legal department is determining we can't do this even if we did want to. Again, some states have handed it over wholesale. I can't speak to why, maybe Florida or someone else is doing that. But in Michigan and in Minnesota and in New York and a number of other states, the argument is we couldn't do this even if we wanted to. So I think there is a legal ramification here because if this information were handed over, it's an argument that it would be a violation of privacy. The lawsuit that's working its way through federal court here in Michigan against Michigan, that is what people who are looking to join the lawsuit are arguing is if my state shared this information about me with the federal government, my state would be violating my rights here as a Michigan resident. And they can't do that. We're very strict about that, actually.
So, Haley, speaking of that lawsuit, what happens next in that legal fight? What are you watching out for?
Yeah, so that lawsuit's kind of in an interesting holding pattern right now. Obviously, the federal government is still shut down. That is a key part of this whole thing is the people who would be pursuing that lawsuit can't really do that right now as they are furloughed or not working. Also, on the Michigan side, filings have shown that the attorneys who are attached to it from the state's perspective are working through some other cases right now in their own backlogs. So they, too, are requesting extensions. So far, everything's been granted. I expect we'll probably move forward closer to the middle and the end of the month on that. But right now, the courts are taking it seriously. They're giving it the priority it needs. But right now, we just don't have any answers. We don't know what this is going to look like.
That is Haley Harding. She is Michigan reporter at Vote Beat. Haley, thanks so much for keeping us up to date on this case.
Thanks, Haley.
Thank you, guys.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.